Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Welcome, welcome. Yeah, you just heard a scary disembodied voice say recording in progress. So just want to let you know, it's totally fine if you have your camera on. It should just be recording whoever's speaking at all times. So don't worry about showing up in the video or anything. And if you do, I should probably be able to edit you out. So no worries, have your camera on or off, whatever feels more comfortable to you. I'm Jessica with Literary Arts. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so honored and excited to welcome you all and to be joined by the 2023 Penn Award for Poetry and Translation winner and finalist. Congratulations to all our finalists. You guys are amazing, and I'm so excited. I'm also letting people in, so that's why I'm looking everywhere. Okay. For those of you who are not familiar with Literary Arts, we are a nonprofit community-based arts organization with more than 35 years serving readers and writers. Our mission is to engage readers, support writers, and to inspire the next generation with great literature. I want to thank Lynette and all our finalists for partnering with us. She's such an awesome advocate for literature, and I was just excited to host you all and partner up. And I know we have people kind of joining us from all over, which isn't usually our crowd, but it's really exciting to have folks from all over the country. So thanks for being here. Okay, before I introduce our first reader, I just want to kind of quickly remind you of the format of the event. So we're going to hear from each of the finalists, and then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So it'll be super helpful. I mean, let's try this. If you have any question throughout the event, go ahead and type it into the chat, and I'm going to try my best to catch all the questions, and then at the end, we'll do our Q&A. If you're also feeling up for it, we can go ahead and unmute and you can ask your question out loud. So we'll try it. Alrighty, so our first reader tonight is Daniel Borsutsky. Daniel is a poet and translator in Chicago. His most recent book is Written After a Massacre in the year 2018. His 2016 collection, The Performance of Becoming Human, received the National Book Award. Lake Michigan was a finalist for the Griffin International Poetry Prize. His most recent translation is Paula Ilacaba Nunez, The Loose Pearl, winner of the Penn Award for Poetry and Translation. His translation of Gallo Gigliotto's Valdivia received the 2017 National Translation Award, and he has also translated collections by Raúl Zurita, James Luis Eunun. He teaches English and Latin American and Latino studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I'm going to play a video. There he is.
Hello, my name is Daniel Borzutsky. I am sorry to not be there live with you all today. I very stupidly got the time wrong. I thought it was at, I thought that 4 p.m. Pacific meant 2 p.m. Central, but of course it means 6 p.m. Central. So silly me, I can't be there at 6 p.m. Central. So my apologies. I am going to record my reading. I will be reading from the translation of The Loose Pearl by Chilean poet and novelist Paula Ilacaba Nunez. The Loose Pearl, or La Perla Suelta, was published in Chile in 2005. And I'm going to just briefly introduce it and then read a few pages from it. So in her introduction to the book, Paula describes these poems as, quote, songs of desperation directed at patriarchy, a patriarchy that did not allow a young working class woman to be single on money. The protagonist of this book is a young woman who sees herself as split in two between the loose one and the pearl, different identities formed in relation to the desires and pathologies of the men who seek yet fail to control her. I, of course, do not share the subject position of the protagonist or the author. It was a translation that challenged me to step far outside of myself and to try to translate the language of pain and anger the book was communicating. I'm mostly not talking about content here. I'm talking about spirit or energy or the mystical underpinnings that breathe through and carry along the writing we love most, the writing that scares us most, the writing that means the most to us. The problem of translation here had to do with how to communicate both affect and physicality, how to transmit desire as affirmation, how to translate the unknowable experience of objection appearing as duality, two personas in one body, of objection fluctuating between depression, anger, and ultimately the refusal of subjugation and humiliation within extremes of blankness, quote, as the pearl constructs herself from herself into herself. The book is a book-length poem that is split into about 40 or 50 prose poems. And I'm gonna jump right in around about 25% into the book. And I chose some poems that kind of highlight the duality that I was speaking of between the loose one and the pearl as it appears within the body of the protagonist. The master has disappeared. You see it in how these pages darken and how the burnt ones recompose in the appearance of the king. The master and the eunuch who are the same, with his imprint, his killjoy, his contempt, his flaccidity. They collapsed at the perfect moment. The mares don't graze anymore. They lie around with their jaws open, their haunches entangled in the fibers of the threadbare orange bed. Fragments of the departures, of the openings, of the orgasms of the woman who was singing at the beginning, the one who was saying something like, "It's been a month since I've fucked anyone," or she could also have said, "I'm demolished. I look like broken pieces in the constellation," or when she sang, "This bed has seen it all," or "Feed me when I'm hungry," etc. Now, this woman took a name, the loose one, and she has a homologue who is herself, who is an other, who is all of them, who follows the tantrums and the forms she takes to get it on with whoever is into it, so that later she can dump them, the pearl. The loose one is like this. She thinks her flaws and disguises make her unique. I love this asymmetry, she was saying one night while trimming her bangs in the bathroom. And she looked at herself over and over again in the mirror. Then the trim became less precise when her eye glanced over at the orange bed. "No one's home tonight," the loose one would say, "just me and the crisis." Then she started to laugh. Then came the stomach pain, and the itch in her belly was instantaneous. That same night, she went to the window thinking, what's going on with my eunuch? What exchange of his secretions is he involved in? Will he even suspect that he left a parasite in my belly? The loose one mumbles, her throat raw from so much talking so much in vain. Because even though she doesn't love him, the word weighs on her. And what does she do now in the solitude of the word, in the cruel speech of the days? The loose one waits and waits. And when someone appears, she attacks, because that's how the loose one is. When something is put between her thighs, she doesn't stop until it's taken out and put back in again. The way she likes it or the way they like it. And afterwards, nobody stops her. Once the loose one gets going, no one stops her. And the pearl had thought that she would never again cry for him, for the master, for the eunuch. There's no way to singularize it, the loose one says, wiping a teary eye. The wound takes many forms, names, and twisted, languid memories. The loose one haunts herself all day, exactly all day long, and at night she gets worse, and the pearl acts like it's nothing, but she can't take it anymore. Meanwhile, the loose one takes great pains to please everyone, but it's not enough. They always suffocate her, straightening her corset. She repeats herself for them. I'm not that one. Why can't they understand? Like this. The two of them get together and act like it's nothing, but it's something. The loose one breathes melancholically while she comes down with diarrhea. The pearl acts like it's nothing, as if nothing is wrong with her, as if nothing were running through her, like that, just so, with her usual nonchalance. Then they look at each other and swap roles, swap conditions and souls, and inevitably one of them doesn't care. She comes or finishes erratically and closes her eyes with apathy. Now let something else come, the pearl says, with the parasite boiling in her belly, her neck aching, her eyes dried up from so much crying. In that moment, in another temporality, the king moves, scratches his head, tries to wake up, but remains lethargic and beautiful, anesthetized in the fury of a clear and silent night. And I'm still here, playing fast and loose, says the pearl, as she smooths and savors what she doesn't have, what doesn't touch her. She breathes, panting, evoking the part of the king that's wrapped up in his enigma, in his detached poise, in his arrogant disdain. And in this way, the loose one still expects to keep fucking, even when they tell her no. No, she seeks camouflage in her own rotten guts, in the diarrhea that will soon gush out. No, no, the king will say when I tell him to take me, to notice me, to leave me, that it doesn't matter. The loose one repeats this while she looks and looks at him, and the iciness of his allure turns out to be endless, as if it will never run out. And she admits that, and the obstinacy of his beauty. There are a few other male characters, the king, the master, and the eunuch, who kind of revolve in and out of the in the bedroom, really, and the mental room of the pearl and the loose one. So that's part of that. I will just read a couple pieces from the very end of the book to conclude. Still, the old habits are there, still the deformities, the aimless spaces and the moans of hysteria, still the spinning of the dreary and undesired torsos, typical of those days when she would go and go in the orange bed without knowing where. Still there are spaces in her heart. There are still feared, scabby, choleric spaces. Still the pearl carries with her fits of laughter. Still those distant grindings moving on top of her. She sobs from a thick and tearless eye, even if she says it, even if she doesn't say it, even if she walks masked through naked, even if she walks naked through her house, looking at herself in the dyslexic mirror in the forms she has superimposed upon herself, rigid, radiant. Nevertheless, she still writhes deep inside a skein of black yarn the pearl doesn't know she traps herself in, which she doesn't know how to get out of. Nevertheless, everyone looks at her and they say how she shines, how this other one dazzles. That's how dialogues repeat themselves: storms, occupied spaces, extremes of blankness. That's how the jewel, the pearl, the loose one are all joined in the skein of yarn, which, when collected, knows itself to be whole and dispersed like the mane of one of the mares that give birth again and again. That's it, the mares, their tongues, the sweat, their hair in the house. That's it, the mares screeching in secret, the violent landing, the murmurs that mix with the heat of the trash when it appears. That's it, the loose one in front of the mirror, reciting, fucking, thinking, please, no, not again, please, no. That will conclude there. Thank you all so much for listening. Thanks to my fellow readers and translators for organizing this, for inviting me to participate. And thanks so much to Literary Arts and to everyone who's here. Good night.
Okay, I think I'm back. Yay! Awesome. All right. Our next reader is Connor Bracken.
If that's the case.
Let's see what's going on. Well, I hope I haven't missed.
There we go. Our next reader is Connor Bracken. Connor is the author of the poetry books Henry Kissinger, Mon Amour from Bull City Press, The Enemy of My Enemy Is Me from Diode Editions, as well as translator of Mohammed Khair Eddin's Scorpionic Sun from CSU Poetry Center, and Jean Damarique's No Way in the Skin Without This Bloody Embrace from Ugly Duckling Press. He teaches at the Cleveland Institute of Art.
Thanks, Jessica. And thanks to Lynette for helping organize this. Thanks again to you, Jessica, for hosting. Thanks to everybody for joining. And I'm so pleased to be here sharing the screen with such wonderful translators and poets. It's quite an honor, and it's quite an act to follow after Daniel. What emotional intensity that reaches. It's great to hear him read it aloud. And it's a delight to precede Tessa's work as well as Lynette's and Liz's. So I'll just say a brief bit about Jean Damarique. He's the poet whose book I've translated here. It's called No Way in the Skin Without This Bloody Embrace. It's his third book of poems. I'm sorry, his second book of poems. It is a book-length poem that is much sparer than kind of what you heard just now from Daniel. Those poems are big on the page and take up a lot of space, whereas with Jean's poems, they take up very little space. They're very lyrical, and they work much more with spareness along the way. And one of the things that drew me to this work, in addition to the work that he does with sound and rhythm, which are skills that he honed during his time on the slam circuit in Haiti, and then also as a rapper today, are also his deep and abiding attentions to the form that the poem takes on the page and how that form can be an extra participant in creating sites of meaning that might otherwise be unavailable in an oral situation, which is not necessarily unique per se in poetry for the page. We see this a lot, people working with line breaks, stanza breaks, and kind of visual rhymes and things like this. But the thing that is most intense about the way that Jean is doing this in this particular book is that the margins are very strict, that the poems themselves, as I already mentioned, are very spare. They don't take up very much space. And that is in part to concentrate on what is happening within these poems. It is also in some ways, I believe, a visual mimic of the shape of a hurricane, where you have all of this kind of white roaring space around you and then this dead calm in the center, which Haiti, being a Caribbean nation, has experienced a lot of hurricanes, experienced a lot of natural disasters. Those have been deeply important, for better or worse, in shaping the political, sociocultural situation of the nation. And the form of the poems bring that resonance as well. And then a third reason for the importance of the way that he's playing with the form in this regard is how strictly he places the pressure on certain words to the degree that they will break before they can finish. So the margin will break words so that they won't be making the same kind of sense or communicating the same kind of associations that they would if they were whole, which is very intentional on his part and goes to a deeper thematic move throughout the book, which is to show that the situation, the circumstances of the poem, which is a metaphor for the situation, the circumstances of the speaker, are violent, in that they have an intense and immovable consistency to them. But despite that violence, or because of that violence, breakage occurs, but that does not mean that the breakage is one that is going to destroy what is happening in the poem. And in fact, it reveals certain other moments of, one might not say beauty, but extra meaning. And so this is a poem that is just as important to be heard aloud as it is to be seen on the page. I have not provided a visual for you, but if you do at some point, perhaps pick one up. I highly encourage you to scrutinize the way that the page itself is creating these extra pressures. And so I'm going to read from about the middle of the book itself. It's got a less specific narrative circumstance than The Loose Pearl. We have a speaker who kind of portrays himself as an apocalyptic flaneur in the wonderful French tradition of the foppish 19th century dandy wandering around Paris just to be seen and wearing his finest. Though this is a tradition that has also extended into the post-colonial Francosphere. You might see it most often with the sapeurs in Democratic Republic of Congo, but we also have our very hip, skinny jean wearing speaker striding among the ruins to be seen. and he's pretty cagey, but he's also one who is very much not at home wherever he is. He is similar to Jean in that he lives both in Haiti and overseas, specifically in Belgium and France. But even though he hails from Haiti and has lots of love for it, it's also a place that he has a lot of ambivalence towards for some of the reasons that we may have seen today or in our contemporary moment with the Haitian political situation, where the state is broken, the state is not able to forestall gang violence, and not able to provide the kinds of relief that is necessary after certain disasters. And so there's a sense of discomfort at home, there's a sense of discomfort abroad. And so in the middle of the poem really is the sense of the crossing out, the crossing song. And so with that, I'll go ahead and move into a poem, I'm sorry, a section about halfway through the book. And each of the sections starts with a dedication. And so this one is dedicated to a city whose wound is mine, which I take to be Port-au-Prince. For a city whose wound is mine. The streets are nameless because of traveling crime. A tower of flames in its back, my city binges on fresh cannons, sings of a life that sags on the page. It watches humans fall as if it's watching cascades of piss. Your passport, concrete reinforced with ripples. Your screen, the roofs that dribble misery. Port-au-Prince, you breathing rubble, you tenant of the void, but memory shambles. My city of difficult hours, what time in your eye won't sink? Nights rise from the other side of azure urges. The nights take command of hope's byways. Life falls aside so the lamps can pass through. It so happens that we lower the sun at midday. Sky damp with a red pact, a canonized city? Far from it. It fires on the beauty passing by. Glory to the cannon's reign. All the time, the pestering head, the enormous blue paper, it struggles to touch. My city on the monumental edge of blood. Joint of fatal orgasm, subsidy of lungs swaying up to the lips threshold, dreading being burned. In our ranks, the weapons are allowed to walk. Every single street knows how to live without chaos in the silvered glass of death. The weapons are allowed to walk, to stride under the eyes of the day. Not a single light will be lit off the question of the black dead ends. So I'll move on to the following section, which is dedicated to Aleppo and other ruins. So that section that I just read was specifically dedicated to Port-au-Prince and the situation there, wherein there is a lot of difficulty, one might say lightly. But I think it's important to note too that Jean does not necessarily believe that the reasons for the difficulties experienced in Haiti are local to Haiti, that they are in fact part of a larger project, one that is coordinated or not, it doesn't really matter, but a larger project of consistent exploitation that you can see in other nations that have been affected by a variety of different post-colonial issues, such as Syria and beyond. So this is where the poem steps back and looks a little bit more to the international scene to understand the degree to which his own experiences are linked to the experience of others throughout the global South. So for Aleppo and other ruins. Sewing the days with the thread of sobs, the tarnished human voice. The people name but never call themselves. All you need is some ID to pay for the storm's thousand lashes. Blade in the skin of the left behind. The world that embraces me is the one that wounds. It wounds, acid ink that haunts the margins. The world wounds. It oozes when the soldier's palm caresses metal. Tears on the house. Sadness for Aleppo and its crop of eyes. Shore of hacked up hopes, we are crossing an era that writes itself out with clumps of mad grasses, dreary seasons hailing our retinas fall. The dreams sleep naked, so the graves have clothes. Tomorrow is ashamed of breaking its shells. Hope is warm beer poured onto a hangover. Tomorrow is for the young, they say, but hush up. Children are dying in the day's soft chop. Children are dying from a fiery hunger, from cancer of the brain or cancer of the mind. They're dying. They die totally frozen inside the sun of a vicious world. There is no parenthesis for death. Rainbow lanes through the rough waters of history. We are not the nightmare's sperm in humanity's pupils, not just a clod of earth. Our heads aren't uncomplicated pebbles. Our heads aren't pebbles without speech. But the world swallows us like an army of dust, who only find safety in the hands of the wind. We drink up death with no glass spasm, ignoring all the while, however, the taste of carcass. One carcass, two carcasses, some carcasses. We love taking account. We're learning how to count. 100 people disappeared near here, 1,000 killed over there, 3,000 collapsed in a distant island cliff. It's forgotten instantly if it's not forgotten soon. We spit on life, pare the skin off history with the blades of ego. We really only know how to spit. And I'll leave off with this final section. This is dedicated to who he calls my son, Jacques-Steven Alexis, who was a Haitian novelist, writer, thinker, politician who died very young, most likely due to, I believe it was the Duvaliers assassinating him for his political views. And so another thread that runs through Jean's work, maybe perhaps unsurprisingly, is one of political activism, and one that understands that poetry is not just an art for enjoying oneself, but is also an incendiary weapon that can be utilized. And for that, especially in situations where the politics are not ones that are hospitable to a fifth estate or an open media or anything like that, that turns one into a target for the regime. And so Jean spends a decent amount of time pointing out this constellation of other writers like Nazim Hikmet or Jacques-Steven Alexis and other poets and writers of this kind who are doing the kind of work in speaking the truth to power, however obliquely, but however necessarily. And this one is both an elegy and in some ways also a celebration of the person who did this work and the work they were doing. For my son, Jacques-Steven Alexis, it wasn't you, but the acid in the Embrace anthology of scratches, light pelted with blindness. Your skin, restive province that dynamites the track of meaning, it wasn't you. No shortcut for the stars. Injustice is a looming sail, a gloomy army that laces its huge boots on the face of suns. It hasn't seen your dream flare up at the edge of the stones. It was not you. It was not your face, a smile submachine gunned like hail rising from the skin. They weren't your eyes, but a gaze grown out of the ruins. Columns of tears that trace the paths of stars. You know how to see behind shadows. You know how to walk outside these steps sketched by the wet, indifferent world. Your name is a prose, the pages make thrash. It wasn't you. Your tongue hasn't met the heel salt. The objector's sky makes no deals with mud. The snarling sky doesn't crawl with its backs bowed. You lived standing. You threw yourself into the fire to wave the communal flame. Without complaining, your name melted in the ashes. Fighting is burning. Resisting is taking night's road toward the sun's dreams. Fist raised toward the risk of ending in the ground's infinite harms. And then the torture. Red breaking the rungs of your skin. You lived standing. You lived standing, the better to walk through the blue door. Thanks again.
Thank you, Connor. I'm going to come back to gallery. Hi, everyone. All right. Our next reader is, here, let me admit this person very quickly. Okay. Our next reader is Elizabeth T. Gray Jr., a poet, translator, and corporate consultant. Her poetry collections include the long-term poem Salient from New Directions and the poetic sequence series India from Four Way Books, Translations include Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, selected poems of modern Iranian poet Forough Farkhzad from New Directions, a finalist for the 2023 Penn Prize for Poetry and Translation, and Wine and Prayer translations of classical Persian poet Hafiz. She serves on the boards of Kimbibliofiction, Friends of Writers, the Belit Poetry Journal Foundation, and of Human Rights and Democracy in Iran. She lives in New York City.
Would be good to unmute myself, right? Can you hear me? Good. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Literary Arts. Really a pleasure to meet you all, but really to have gotten to know my fellow finalists. Incredible work. A real honor to be here. Let me, we are. So Forough Farkhzad is probably the preeminent iconic woman poet of modern Iran. There really isn't another woman poet that gets in close to her, though there are a couple of others. She was a trailblazer. And in a country where for millennia, women have lived silent and diminished and in the shadow of their men, she broke all the rules. She was born into a military family in Tehran in 1934. She was a creative and headstrong, well-read and obsessed with poetry. And at 16, she insisted on marrying a much older cousin, and they had a son. When an editor in Tehran published her poem, Sin, which spoke candidly of sex and desire in the first-person voice of a woman, you can imagine how that went down in the late 50s, early 60s. Her husband, family, and the clerical establishment were horrified. She became notorious. And faced with terrible choices, she chose her art and relinquished custody of her son and moved to Tehran to make her way on her own as a single woman, which was unheard of. She was admired, scorned. She produced an award-winning film about a leper colony in northwestern Iran. She carried on a long-term affair with her boss, the married filmmaker Ibrahim Golestan, and she wrote stark and stunning personal and political verse, all at a time during which the Shah of Iran had the country very much under the thumb of his secret police. She died in a car accident in 1967 at the age of 32. In her poetry and film, and at high cost, she claimed space and voice. Her books have been banned in Iran for decades, while her poetry is recited by men and women in the streets of Iran today and throughout the diaspora. She transformed Persian poetry and remains a beacon to artists, especially women and marginalized artists who seek freedom in all its forms. This is the book, out from New Directions last year. I'm going to read, some of her poems are very, very long. So I'm going to read just 4 of them, 2 of which are quite short. I'm going to start with the poem Sin, which made her reputation. Now, Persian poets write a lot about love and the beloved, but they're usually men and they're talking about young boys or God or something, but they sure don't sound like this. Sin. I sinned a sin full of pleasure in an embrace that was warm and fiery. I sinned in arms that were hot and vindictive and made of iron. In that dark and silent sanctuary, I looked into his eyes full of secrets. My restless heart trembled in my chest at the demands of his hungry eyes. In that dark and silent sanctuary, I sat agitated at his side. His lips poured violent desire across my lips. I was freed from my mad heart's grief. I whispered words of love into his ear. I want you. Oh, my love, I want you. Oh, life-giving embrace. You, oh, my mad lover. The passion in his eyes lit a flame. Red wine danced in the cup. In the soft bed, my euphoric body trembled on his chest. I sinned a sin full of pleasure beside a dazed and trembling body. Oh, Lord, what did I know about what I did in that dark and silent sanctuary? The wind will carry us. Alas, in my little night, the wind has a tryst with the leaves of the trees. In my little night, there is the dread of devastation. Listen, do you hear the gusts of darkness? Excluded, I watch this happiness. I am addicted to my despair. Listen, do you hear the gusts of darkness? In the night, something is happening now. The moon is red and agitated, and above this roof that fears it will crumble at any moment, clouds, like a crowd of mourners, wait for the moment to rain. A moment, then nothing. Beyond this window, night shudders and the earth ceases to spin. Beyond this window, an unknown is watching you and me. Oh, you, green from head to toe, put your hands like a burning memory in my love-struck hands, and entrust your lips like a warm feeling of existence to the caresses of my love-struck lips. The wind will carry us with it. The wind will carry us with it. In her later work, there was a huge shift in her work around the publication of a book called Another Birth. This is a later poem that blends both elegy, politics, and love. It's called After You, and the you is her 7th year, the year that she turned 7. So the poem is addressed to the year she turned 7 and to the self she was in that year. Oh, my 7th year, the year I turned 7. Oh, wondrous moment of departure. After you, everything that happened in a mass of craziness and insanity. After you, the window that had been such a vivid and bright connection between the bird and us, between the wind and us, broke. After you, that clay doll that said nothing but water, 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 drowned in water. After you, we killed the voice of the cicada and became attached to the sound of the school bell rising over our ABCs and to the whistle of factories. After you, our play space that had been under tables moved from beneath the tables to behind desks, and from behind desks to the tops of desks, and we played at the tables and lost. We lost your colors, oh, my 7th year. After you, we betrayed each other. After you, we erased all the scrawled memories from the plastered temple walls of the alleyway with bullets and blood spatter. After you, we went to the squares and screamed, "Long live, death too." And in the square's uproar, we applauded for the little singing coins that had cleverly come to town for a visit. After you, we murdered each other. We judged for love, and while our hearts sat uneasily in our pockets, we judged in love's name. After you, we set off for the cemeteries, and death was breathing under grandmother's chador, and death was that enormous tree where on this side of the beginning, The living were tying cloth wishes to its exhausted branches. And on the far side of the end, the dead were clawing at its phosphorescent roots. And death was seated atop the holy tomb, and at each of its corners, suddenly, a blue tulip lamp flared. I hear the sound of the wind. I hear the sound of the wind, oh my seventh year. I got up and drank water, and suddenly I remembered how your newly planted fields feared the swarm of locusts. How much must be paid? How much must be paid to grow this cement cube? Whatever had to be lost, we lost. We set out without a lamp, and the moon, the kind feminine moon, was always there in our childhood memory of a mud and thatch plastered roof, and above those newly planted fields that feared the swarm of locusts. How much must be paid? This last poem is very short, and it closes out the end of her posthumous volume that was published, obviously, after her death. It was both the favorite poem of the late Empress of Iran. Well, actually, she's still alive, but she's no longer Empress. And you also find it apparently written on the walls of prisons in Iran. It's called The Bird is Mortal. I am depressed. I am depressed. I go out on the veranda and run my fingers across the taut skin of the night. The lamps of connection have gone dark. The lamps of connection have gone dark. No one will introduce me to the sun. No one will take me to the sparrow's party. Remember its flight, because the bird is mortal. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, I think. Let me remove spotlight. There we are. Okay, next we're going to hear work from Tess Lewis. Tess Lewis is a writer and translator from French and German. Her translations include work by Peter Handke, Walter Benjamin, and Philip Jacotet. Her awards include the 2017 Penn Translation Award for her translation of Maha Handerlap's novel Angel of Oblivion, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Her essays and reviews have appeared in a number of publications, including Granta, Book Forum, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. She is an advisory editor for the Hudson Review and a co-curator of the Festival of New Literature.
So I have the pleasure to stand in for the introduction that Tess Lewis would have read were she able to join us. Unfortunately, she is ill, but her words and her translations will be able to join us, thankfully. So I will read what she has to say about Maya Handerlap's Distant Translate. The poems in this collection explore the interplay of language and identity and revel in the richness and hazards found in linguistic borders. Not only are they a delight to read with their vivid, evocative imagery, the unexpected connections they make, and their supple rhythms, but they also draw necessary attention to the political undertones and overtones of words, and to the ways, quote, smaller languages and cultures can fall prey to dominant ones. Geopolitical powers have long drawn boundaries for their own interests, carving up ethnic groups, subsuming them in separate national entities, and usually prompting the attrition of minority languages. Yet, as the poems of Langue Transit show, these languages can prove resilient, especially when poets give voice to their dreams. Handerlap's poems invite the reader to experience the inner world of someone who, as a member of an ethnic minority, lives on the margins both linguistically and societally. feeling at home neither in the old world of her first language and culture, nor in the new world she has entered through her second language. The Austrian writer Maya Haderlap has inhabited a linguistic no man's land since birth. Born into the Slovenian-speaking minority of Carinthia, Austria's southernmost province, she was educated in Slovenian and German. She established herself as an accomplished poet with several volumes of poetry written in Slovenian. Then in 2011, at the age of 50, she burst onto the German language literary scene with her novel, Angel of Oblivion, a work based on the experiences of her family and her community, many of whom fought as partisans against the Nazis during the Second World War and suffered resentment and suspicion from the German-speaking majority in the decades after. In Distant Transit, her first collection of poetry written in German, Haderlap returns to several of her novel's central themes: the fate of minority communities, the burden of history and the after effects of conflict, the ways language can enforce borders as well as overcome them, how language shapes identity, and the trials faced by intelligent, curious girls growing up in a conservative patriarchal community. But she addresses these themes on a more intimate level. In these poems, the personal is political, but not only. Haderlap also explores and celebrates the vicissitudes of love, closeness to the natural world, and, slightly ironically, the powerful presence of Slovenian myths and legends among the Corinthian Slovenes. And now I have the pleasure of turning the poems over to Lynette and Liz.
The first of the 4 poems that Tess wanted us to read this evening is called Borderlands. Borderlands. They are border lines knotted a string of snares and transgressions. In the annals of division, the boundary was inscribed as victor. In wartime, the border strip swung back and forth. Villages went astray, slid to the periphery. Their inhabitants sealed their throats with crude locks, stood watch over the silent crime scene that I entered lightheartedly. Often, followed by their eyes, I took the armored path to a neighboring land, to hear of earlier days when fences still lined the pastures and a kindred echo bound all the names. Where a road once ran, its trace disappears. All is margin and forgetting and transition. And this is called Transit. On the shores of the new land, you will discard your mother tongue. Clouds that drift by above will be echoes of words you once spoke, but now withhold. Long after you are gone, the nights of the air will fulfill the figments of your imagination. Love, worry, harmony, as strange as the giants of La Mancha. The house you once lived in is a roughly timbered frame of smoke. It hovers over you, barely perceptible, imponderable, like you. Washed up on the shore, an old comb, the wrong sock in the right shoe, the crumpled horizon in your hand, an island of garish paper.
And continuing for Tessa's poems, she so wanted to be here and she became suddenly ill and lost her voice to laryngitis. And so I'm reading from her book. And this is On the Shore Path in the Evening Light, on which I stood one day at the end of a summer that broke me open like a small fruit. I was bitter and very tough. A mote of light falls on me, a spark from abiding time. The impatience still throws its blossoms into the air like balls. It tumbles down, sinks in the water, and disappears. A grain of light rises, as it had back then, and dies away. The shore path is now built up, shifted, torn out of the meadow, and discarded. I, too, have emerged repeatedly as a translation of myself, transferred and rewritten. I appear in a new transcription, although in a similar form. The second of light takes flight. The spark of time that remains scatters and returns. And the last poem, translation. Is there a zone of darkness between all languages? A black river that swallows words and stories and transforms them? Here, sentences must disrobe, begin to roam, learn to swim, not lose the memory that nests in their bodies, a secret nucleus. Will the columbine's blue be a shade of violet when it reaches the other side? And the red bee balm become a pear? Cinnamon sweet? Will my tench be missing a fin in the light of this new language? Will it have to learn to crawl or to walk upright? Does language know how to draw another toward it, or only how to turn the other one away? Can each word then risk the transit, believe itself invulnerable, dipped in pitch and hard as steel?
Thank you all, and congrats to Tess. I hope she feels better soon. Okay, and our last reader today is Lynette Yetter. Lynette is a Pushcart Prize nominated poet, a 2023 PEN Award for Poetry and Translation finalist, and a panpipe playing Buddhist lesbian artist who shares her time between La Paz, Bolivia and Portland, Oregon. Oh, I'm going to let someone in. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Her Reed College master's thesis led to her bilingual Spanish-English book, Adela Zamudio Selected Poetry and Prose from Fuente Fountains Books. She played panpipes on the opening title credits of the Academy Award-nominated documentary Recycled Life, and you can learn more about Lynette Yetter's music, movies, books, and art to touch your soul and make you think over at LynetteYetter.com.
Thank you so much. So appreciate our time together today. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, friends, everyone. I'm proud that Literary Arts and PEN America celebrates and honors the passionate work to which I and my editors at Fuente Fountain Books have long dedicated ourselves. In order to finally bring the wisdom of Bolivia's most celebrated writer, Adela Zamudio, who lived from 1854 to 1928, to English-speaking readers. In Bolivia, that Andean country in the heart of South America, well, Zamudio's birthday there, October 11th, is a national holiday. How many women do you know whose birthday is a national holiday? I first learned about Adela Zamudio when I lived near the plaza that bears her name in La Paz, Bolivia. I would sit on a bench gazing at her monument, wondering who she was. So I studied everything I could by and about her, and here we are. Self-taught, Adela Zamudio experienced both privilege and poverty. She dedicated her life to women's and indigenous people's rights and education. In her poetry, she satirically speaks truth to power and celebrates lesbian love. Her ironic critiques of white, male, supremacist, industrialized Western society a century ago continue to resonate today. I open with Adela Zamudio's love poem to her sister, who was her lifelong companion. Yesterday afternoon, to my sister, Amalia. After a hot day came a cool, fresh evening, and in a delicious place, sheltered beneath vaulted leafy boughs. We paused. I lay my head in your lap. You started to sing. My gaze wandered by chance until there in the twilight, we saw daylight expire. The sky was serene, everywhere blue. I leaned on your bosom, my heart full of peace, listening to your song. The moon shone in the sky. In its warm light, I saw you like an angel of comfort with folded wings who'd come to watch over me. Absorbed in your song, I listened to you for a long time. Your voice touched me so deeply, tears poured, I knew not why. So sweet was my sadness that I pretended we were in Eden. I raised my head, then discovered with surprise that you were weeping too. Maybe we both thought of something at the same moment, something we both remembered. That's why together we wept in the echo of your voice. The moon, clear and beautiful, suddenly darkened through vaporous clouds. Its dim, mysterious light poured enchantment. When I looked again into your candid countenance, like the moon, it clouded for an instant, and I saw your tears shine. Never in the midst of contentment had I seen you so angelic. That moment, that moment when emotion illuminated you with its heavenly flame. Let's pray to heaven that always united like this. Our song rises as one, our weepings infused, and that you never part from me. This next poem, Born a Man, is Zamudio's most well-known poem. In Bolivia, every school child is taught this poem as part of their country's foundational literature. Born a Man was first published in 1887, and I translated Zamudio's rewrite, which was published in Paris in 1914. Born a Man. It's her endless labor to correct the stupid klutziness of her husband. And in the house, surprise, surprise, he's inept and fatuous. But he's always the boss because he's a man. If she writes poems, well, a man must have written them. People assume she just took dictation. Surprise, surprise. If that man is not the poet, why assume he was? Because he's a man. A wise and compassionate woman can't vote in elections, but the most narcissistic, sociopathic man can. Surprise, surprise. If he can just sign his name, even an idiot can vote because he's a man. When he's down on his luck, he gets depressed, drinks, gambles. She resists, struggles, and prays. Surprise, surprise, we call her the weaker sex and him the stronger sex because he's a man. If her husband commits adultery, she must forgive him, but he can seek revenge. Surprise, surprise, he can even murder his adulterous wife because he's a man. Oh, privileged mortal, for being so perfect and so ethical, you enjoy lifelong renown. What did you do to deserve all of this? You were born a man. I wonder if Florida will now want to ban this book. Okay, I present this final poem titled Fragment as an introduction to Della Zamudio's philosophy about the important role of poets and writers in society. In the midst of its black storms of mad desire or criminal passion, Humanity guards hidden pearls at the bottom of the ocean of the heart. There, in the intimacy of one's conscience, where there is always more sorrow than evil, who doesn't harbor a generous instinct that tends to the truth? Fearless diver who has experienced the pounding waves of society, the writer, knows how to discover the soul's pearl hidden in the shell of suffering. She shows the world that precious jewel set in the gold of her creative genius, noble crown of the human temple, the ideals of truth and good. Thank you. Yay.
Thank you, Lynette. That was so awesome. Okay, I think I can see you all now. All right, we're gonna enter our Q&A portion of the event. So please either type in your question and I'll ask it out loud, or if you're comfortable, you can raise your hand. Is that even an option there? Yeah, raise hand or unmute yourself and we'll get into your questions.
Mm.
Someone's raised hand, but I don't know where it is. Oh, there we are, Connor.
Yeah, it's me. I know I always take a long time to ask questions and these kinds of things, but so I do have a question for my fellow translators. I'm curious about what each of you found most challenging in your experience translating the poems in these particular books, and how you worked with, surrendered to, triumphed over these challenges.
Liz, it looks like you're getting ready to respond.
I was just going to say the same for you.
Okay, for me, the biggest challenge was, I think, patience. That I kept polishing and repolishing, working and collaborate. Oh, and I see that Judith has a question too. And so collaborating with my editors in both Spanish and English, going back and forth and constantly polishing, and it's a never-ending process, and we could probably still be polishing because we're always changing and seeing things from new angles. And for me, that was that patience to keep polishing, but also to know, like, okay, this, step away, publish it. And that for me was the biggest challenge.
You know, I think for me, the challenge was that her work is a very innovative fusion of surrealism and her own sort of passionate imagination, and also the imagery and, I want to say, sort of narrative frames that she inherits both from the classical Persian tradition, which I would have had no clue about if I had not spent a lot of time translating the classical medieval poets, but also Quranic references. So it pulls together a lot of stuff that's not actually visible there on the surface, and might not actually be visible in translation, but informs the understanding of it. The other weird thing about Persian is there are no capital letters, and they're way ahead of us on the pronouns. You cannot tell from a pronoun whether it is masculine, feminine, or neuter. Or in the classical Ghazal tradition, you can't tell whether the beloved is a young boy, the Shah, or a patron god, or a woman. And so in English, there are just so many workarounds you can do before you kind of have to put your money down and make a choice. And I think that because her work has such fragments, I mean, apparently she also, you know, got into psychedelic drugs in the 60s when she was in Europe. And so there's surrealism, there's, you know, sort of hallucinogenic stuff. And it's a lot of translators of hers tried to sort of smooth stuff off, and they would decide what made sense, and then they made the poem do that. And I tried very hard to not second guess her. You know, if she wanted to leave that fragment sitting there of this bizarre image, and I couldn't figure out like how it connected anywhere, and neither could any of the other 12 translators that I looked at, nor my Persian friends, you know, man, just leave it the way it is. That's what she wanted. There's also no critical edition of her work, so you can't tell, you know, where the stanza breaks are supposed to be, or whether there's punctuation. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. And in some editions, the censor simply deleted huge hunks of the work. So because there's not a definitive text and you have all of these other variables, I found it was very hard making choices.
That's great. Thank you for giving us a window into both of your processes. I see that Judith has a question. I'd love to hear what it is.
Thank you. I was intrigued, Lynette, this is a question for you. The poem about because he's a man, which is taught in all those schools and obviously would never be allowed to survive in most states here. I was interested about that, but I also noticed that you were translating from a quite a later a version of the book, which I presume that perhaps the author had made some changes in, or I don't know, did she make some changes? And if so, did that poem survive in the same form from the first edition to the much later edition? I can't remember, there was quite a lot of years in between, I know. And I would be interested to know if you came across changes of that kind, and if so, whether they became more outrageous or less outrageous.
Thanks. Yeah. So 1887 was the first edition, and then 1914. So yeah, span of time.
Yeah.
And she didn't change it very much. It was the same passion, and there was just a couple of phrasings and right now off the top of my head, I'm not remembering which stanzas those were in. And but
Okay,
I definitely thought her rewrite made, just took the power and made it even more of a punch.
good. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Ruth. Here, I'm going to unmute. Oh, can you unmute, Ruth? There we
Sorry,
go.
I was hoping that Connor would answer his own question.
Yes.
Voiced myself on my own petard? No.
Yes. Answer this, Connor.
It's a great question, but I don't say that because it's my own, because it's an endless question. I share a lot of the same feelings, I think, as Lynette did towards her own translation, which is a difficulty in letting go, perhaps. Because I mean, one of the beauties of translation, no matter the closeness of the language that you're working with, there are going to be not infinite, but thousands of different choices that can be made very subtly that will ultimately sum up to a very different cumulative effect. And so it's often difficult to feel like you have landed upon the perfect configuration. But for me, I think it was two things in particular. One was the thing that I mentioned in my rambling preamble, which was the very strictness of the margins and the form and the kinds of pressure that it would put on the line itself. wherein each of the lines would be a clear unit unto themselves, and I could not move past that margin. So I had to work not only in terms of a certain kind of syllabic and imagistic unit, but then also in a physical unit. And so French can sometimes be a more compressed language, and sometimes it could be more a prolix language. So there were times where I would have to my horror, pad out some translations in order to fit that space. And then other times to compress or to lop off or truncate. And I felt that it was necessary. It was primary for me to maintain that fidelity, though I probably shouldn't use fidelity. I don't necessarily like that that noun in the context of translation, but to highlight the importance, the centrality of the margins and the formal choices in the poem in that regard. And that kind of flows into the second component, which was allowing a certain roughness to the language, which I don't know was necessarily always there in the original French. I wouldn't necessarily say that it was mellifluous, but there's a certain swagger to it. There's a certain canny, a canny sense of inversion and play that comes off sometimes a little bit more rough around the edges sometimes in the English. And I had to allow myself to be okay with that in some ways because of the shape, the form, the expanse of the page itself, but in other ways to kind of continue to show readers that this is not a text that is native to the English language, that this is a text that is native to another language, that it is coming through labor to them. And so not wanting in some ways to sand off those edges, not necessarily of the original itself, as you were talking about, Liz, but not wanting to sand off the edges of my own process and my own approximations in order to maybe make the process of translation a bit more present and visible. So I guess I would say those things. I do want to say, I'd like to say that I'm sorry. I am the father of 2 small children and there's a bedtime emergency, so I will have to log off a little bit early. But it has been such a pleasure to share the evening with you all. And I'm very grateful to Lynette and Liz and Jessica and to all of you for being here as well. I hope that you all take care.
Thank you, Connor.
Connor has a newborn.
Oh my gosh.
Right. It wasn't just that he had 2 young children. He's got one that's about 3 weeks old.
Oh my God. Do you have any other questions for Lynette and Elizabeth?
I see Zarad thinking, a question lurking.
I mean, one question to ask you in the audience is, did any of these poets sound like they were really writing from another planet, from a place really outside or different from here who we are and our literature? I mean, you don't have to vote. I'm not like, in a tally. But I mean, they're so different, and I'm so struck by the different voices.
Yeah.
And yes, there are similarities, but the kind of the polyphonic voices that Daniel was reading. Of course, he's not here to answer us or for them. That's a world that I would be unfamiliar with, even if it was down the street here in New York, never mind in a foreign culture. And so I'm just curious as to which of these poets, if any, seemed like they really were from a different world that you got to enter for a bit.
I think a lot of what was read today felt really relevant, even though the style and voice did seem very different from English. A lot of the same themes I felt like were emerging. So it was actually kind of surprising. I guess it's eerie in that way, where it's like other people in completely different societies are dealing with like
Well, they're
similar,
dealing with the same questions.
Yeah.
right?
You know, it's just trying to be free enough to be a person of who you are,
Yeah.
Totally.
you know, and to feel like safe when you get up in the morning and go to bed at night. You know, I think we don't have a lot of poetry translated from, you know, whoever was in the path of Genghis Khan and the Mongols sweeping down through Iran. But if we did, you'd hear some of the same laments, I think.
Totally.
Mhm.
And I suspect, you know, given PEN America's mission, that, you know, that theme is their mission. And I think you see it across, you know, all the finalists and the semifinalists. There was a long list of, you know, 10. And, you know, it's very much about voices that don't get to be heard.
Ashley has a question. Do you want to unmute, Ashley?
Yeah, I love that question, Elizabeth. I would like to throw it back to you and Lynette, because I would love to hear your thoughts on the role that you think, particularly giving the poets that you are translating, the two of you, the role that you feel that translation plays today in the literary world and our cultural world.
Mm.
Just off the top of my head, I think we're living through an enormous wave of translated work. I mean, it could be that I'm a poet and a translator, so I'm attuned to it, but there's just a huge volume of poetry and novels across the world that are being brought into English and other languages. And, you know, I think that enriches English. And, you know, we have the same reaction, which is, wow, that's not so different.
Mhm.
You know, I was on a panel for modern poetry and translation a couple of years ago that they did an issue on refugees. And so I translated a couple of poems by an Iranian refugee who's been living in LA. And at the reading in England, there were refugees from Eritrea and from Ethiopia and from you name it. And man, you know, the similarities and the solidarity across all of them were so striking to me. Even if you didn't, I mean, I had no idea about the history and politics of Eritrea, but it clearly listening to these people, and I mean, it was just horrific. And so I guess, you know, it's very strange. And the more that we hear this, the more it floods into the Western, you know, imperial languages, the more amazing it is. I mean, even a terrible translation in terms of, you know, how informed is it by culture or, you know, linguistic capability or whatever it else, it's an insight to it. Over to you, Lynette.
Yeah, well, there's yeah, as you're saying, like it does seem to be more and more translations into English, where it had been the opposite for so long of, you know, it's like when I'm in Lima, Peru, there's a street that's just like booksellers, and what they're doing is pirating US bestsellers in Spanish. There's like someone in a back room just frantically typing and a translation and cheaply running it off because people want, you know, hey, well, it's cool in the US, I want to know it too. And there's not that thirst here in the US to want to know, hey, what are other folks saying? And
Well, I'm not talking about the bestsellers.
well,
We're talking at a pretty narrow piece of the
yeah,
market here.
yeah. And so like for instance, um especially amazing women authors like Adela Zamudio, who I'm most familiar with, is it was the efforts of other women after she died, for the most part, that we still know about her today, and that I was able, that there was then the monuments built. And when she, let's see, she died in 1928. In 1924, the then president of the country crowned her with real gold laurel leaves in honor of her cultural contributions to the the country, and she was the equivalent of a best-selling author, you know, with a lot of her work being published in magazines and newspapers, as well as the 2 poetry books that she had published, first in Buenos Aires and then in Paris, and other authors like in Chile, and there was all this discussion of women authors, but after she died, you know, it's like men write history for the most part, it has been true, and she just kind of disappeared until 1942, and when her beloved sister's children and grandnieces, you know, her gathered her works together to publish, and so then from there in 1955, a biographer in Bolivia was like, oh, well, why don't I write a biography about her? Very, very thin biography. And it's published in a format like for young readers sort of thing. And then I'm forgetting the year when it was, but there was a woman who was president of Bolivia, and all of her politics I don't necessarily agree with, but the one thing she did good was that she acknowledged Adela Zamudio and made her birthday a national holiday, and it's in honor of all working women, because Adela Zamudio, as she was working class her whole entire adult life, and in fact, when she anyway, I could go on about her because I love her so much. But what I'm saying is that she could have disappeared, but now she's, you know, so celebrated in Bolivia. And Virginia Ayon, who wrote the prologue to the book, to my book of translations, she recently compiled all of Adela Zamudio's works, except for a couple of plays, into a book that the government, the vice presidency, published as one of the 200 books you have to read to understand Bolivia. And so I know there's people like this with this stature and this wisdom and all over the world. But in the US, we think, oh, well, we know everything, and we have to go help the underdogs because we know everything. and I just think it's so important to hear voices and know about people, and learn. Does that answer your question, Ashley?
Absolutely, beautifully. Thank you, Lynette. And thank you, Elizabeth, too.
Thanks for being here, Ashley.
Do we have any more questions?
Elizabeth, some of those sample questions, do any of those pop up that you want to just put out for discussion? Since we have a little time, I think. Oh no, we're right on time. It's like 2 minutes.
We're right on time. And I don't have them in, I don't have them in front of me.
Okay.
No, I think that, you know, all the questions that I wanted to ask one another, plus here I am polling the audience. So, you know, I'm kind of done.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both so much, and everyone else.
Thank you for having us. What a pleasure.
It was
what a
so
lovely way to
fun.
spend the evening.
So much fun. And thank you all for joining us too.
Yeah.
I learned so much, and I can't wait to read more of y'all work.
Yeah.
Audience, thank you so much for being here. And I hope we hear more from you all. I will be looking out.
Right.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Yay.